The New Generation is an era that sits between two of the hottest periods in wrestling history, the golden age of the 1980s and the Attitude Era of the late 90s. They were both times when the WWF was a cultural phenomenon around the world. In comparison, what came in between, from 1993 to 1997, is a version of the WWF that was out of touch and very uncool. This was the only time in WWE's history that they were on the verge of extinction, and no wonder, because most of their output was terrible. The 80s were very kind to Vince McMahon, and for the first couple of years of the 90s, it was like business as usual. In April 1990, WrestleMania 6 drew 67,000 fans to the Toronto Skydome, headlined by Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. But by this time, Hogan was starting to look outside the wrestling business to sustain his career, and he had aspirations to become a Hollywood star. Vince McMahon could see how restless Hogan was getting, so he lined up the Ultimate Warrior to be his replacement. While the Warrior was hugely popular, he lacked the mainstream appeal of Hogan, and behind the scenes, Warrior's relationship with Vince was rocky at best. He gained a reputation for being difficult, and he started to push for more money and creative control, and in the end, things didn't work out. And in 1993, Vince went through a scandal that rocked the wrestling world. He was charged with supplying his performers with steroids, and it looked like he might go to prison. Luckily for him, he was eventually acquitted, but it forced Vince to change the way he presented the WWF. The wrestlers became noticeably smaller, and certain superstars no longer fit onto the roster, metaphorically speaking. Hulk Hogan saw the writing on the wall, and it wasn't long before he jumped to WCW. By mid-1993, the golden era was officially dead, but sadly, what came next was nowhere near as successful. Larger-than-life heroes were replaced by wrestlers with absurd day-job gimmicks. Vince had used these kinds of gimmicks in the 80s, but during the New Generation, he really started scraping the barrel. TL Hopper, for example, was a man that apparently spent his days unblocking toilets with his faithful plunger Betsy, and he spent his evenings sticking Betsy in his opponents' faces. It was difficult to imagine Hopper ever winning the world title, and not just because of his crap gimmick. He was also pretty crap in the ring too, and he never even had a match on pay-per-view. It didn't take long for the gimmick to go down the toilet, but Tony Anthony, the man behind the character, got a second chance in 1997 when he re-debuted as Uncle Cletus as part of the Godwin family. That lasted about a month and a half, and then he was never seen again. Speaking of the Godwins, they were one of the most tedious tag teams of the New Generation. Henry and Phileas Godwin were supposedly pig farmers, and we all wished that they'd stuck to their day job. One of their most memorable moments was when they dumped a bucket of slop over Sonny's head. They even tried to push Henry Godwin as a single star at one point, and he had a memorable feud with a young Triple H. But it wasn't just the Godwins who were making a mess of the tag team division. Take a look at the short-lived Techno Team 2000, for example, and then there was Billy and Bart Gunn, aka the Smoking Guns, the least convincing cowboys in American history. These two had some of the most boring tag matches of the era, and yet Billy wasn't actually a bad wrestler. His Mr. Ass character in 1999 was far better than Cowboy Bill, but it wasn't much competition. I mentioned Triple H earlier, and I think his snobby blue blood character was really good, but man, he had to work with some absolute trash. Duke the Dumpster Droese was one of his opponents, and this guy was a garbage refuse collector during the day, and he even came down to the ring with his own trash can. Even as a kid, I couldn't work out why he did that. If you were a refuse collector, why would you carry a garbage can around with you after work? It just made no sense. Dressed in his garbage man uniform, he would occasionally hit someone over the head with the can, and that's about as exciting as Duke the Dumpster Drose's gimmick ever actually got. There were plenty of other less well-known bad gimmicks during the mid-90s too, the likes of Fantasio the Magician, the Goon who was a hockey player, Spaceman Max Moon, and let's all spare a thought for poor Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese man of war. It's just incredible that any of these gimmicks ever got on TV in the first place. Of course, there were exceptions where over-the-top gimmicks managed to get over really well, the best example being The Undertaker, of course, probably the best wrestling character ever created. Who would have thought that a mortician who was also a zombie would capture everyone's imagination so easily? They really did get it right first time with The Undertaker, but for his on-screen brother Kane, things were almost very different indeed. Glenn Jacobs played various characters before becoming the Big Red Machine. One of them was Isaac Yankem DDS, as he debuted as Jerry Lawler's evil dentist in a storyline with Bret Hart. For all of these terrible two-dimensional day job gimmicks that we saw on the roster at the time, there were a bunch of wrestlers during the New Generation who actually avoided getting lumbered with them entirely. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Vader, Psycho Sid, and a few other guys on the roster were just wrestlers. Sure, they had their own personality traits, but they weren't defined by a weird gimmick or occupation. All of these wrestlers were presented as main event level players at one time or another throughout the mid-90s, but Vince was desperate to make the kind of larger than life superstars that he did during the 80s. While he did manage to solidify the likes of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels as main eventers and future legends, he also had a fair few failures too. He tried to make a main eventer out of King Mabel, for example. Vince always loved big men, and that used to manifest itself as muscle-bound bodybuilder types, but after the steroid scandal, he had to be a bit more careful about who he hired. So he switched the variety of big men away from muscle men to fat men, and Mabel certainly was a large lad. It was 1995 and the WWF had a heel problem in that they didn't have enough top level bad guys on the roster, and so they quickly booked Mabel to win the King of the Ring tournament, and then he went on to challenge Diesel for the WWF title at SummerSlam. For many years, this was considered to be the worst main event in SummerSlam history, and Mabel is still spoken about today as one of the worst ever Kings of the Ring. The big man was prone to causing injuries, including the time that he smashed The Undertaker's orbital bone, which led him having to wear that iconic Phantom of the Opera style mask when he came back. There were plenty of terrible pay-per-view events during this era too, and that's mostly because they expanded the output and introduced In Your House. These In Your House shows were more frequent, cheaper and shorter pay-per-views than the likes of SummerSlam and WrestleMania and the Royal Rumble, and it was a desperate attempt for the WWF to earn more money while the business was doing so badly. What we ended up with was rushed feuds and filler matches as they watered down the WWF's output. The undercards tended to be full of crap, and even a lot of the main events were really badly executed. There were plenty of other times that Vince tried to make fresh main eventers during this period. If we go back to 1993, we can see his attempt to force Lex Luger as the direct replacement for Hulk Hogan. Vince desperately wanted to recapture the 80s magic that he had with the Hulkster, but boy, was Lex the wrong person to try it with. The Lex Express tour saw Luger going across America in a custom bus plastered with red, white and blue that was meant to paint him as the ultimate all-American hero, and despite him literally shaking hands and kissing babies all across the United States, he totally lacked the charm and charisma that Hogan used to connect with the audience. Sure, body slamming Yokozuna on the USS Intrepid was an impressive visual and very patriotic too, but it wasn't enough to get him over. By the time SummerSlam rolled around, Vince had lost all faith in Luger as his new WWF champion, and so in his match with Yokozuna for the title, he won by countout, and therefore the title didn't change hands. The Lex Express sputtered to a halt shortly after, and so did Vince's dream of creating another Hogan-style megastar. But one man that Vince didn't cop out on was Diesel. In 1994, the WWF's roster was thinner than ever, but Diesel checked a lot of Vince's boxes. He was 6'10" with a muscular build, but he wasn't visibly roided up, and he was undeniably cool and charismatic. He got a really fast push, and he won the WWF title in November 1994 in a win that came almost out of nowhere. But Diesel would ultimately be another failure in Vince's quest to create that next megastar world champion. His matches were often criticised for being slow and unexciting, and Vince's decision to present him as a smiling babyface undercut that coolness and that edginess that he seemed to have before. But Vince was determined to keep on pushing him, and his reign ended up lasting nearly a year. But in the end, the fans weren't coming to the shows and the TV ratings were in the toilet. The WWF's presentation during the New Generation era created a vacuum in the wrestling business. The WWF had become deeply uncool, and it was almost insulting to watch if you were over the age of 10, while WCW on the other hand was modifying its presentation to fill the gap that the WWF had lost amongst teenagers and adults. WCW boss Eric Bischoff signed both Diesel and Razor Ramon away from the WWF, and Vince was furious about that. In one of his dumbest ever decisions, he replaced the characters with different wrestlers. Rick Bogner became the new Razor Ramon, and Glenn Jacobs became the new Diesel. Yes, poor Glenn had to endure one more terrible gimmick before finally becoming Kane. This recasting treated the fans like idiots because wrestling isn't like any other fictional TV show. Wrestling is unique in how it blurs the line between fiction and reality. You can't just get away with recasting the wrestlers in the gimmicks, unless they're under a mask of course, but that's a different story. And instead of convincing fans to stick around, all this did was insult their intelligence and make them turn over the channel to see the real Kevin Nash and the real Scott Hall over on WCW. And WCW totally got under Vince's skin by 1996, and no wonder considering they were kicking his ass in the ratings every week. The Billionaire Ted skits was Vince at his most petty and scared. Instead of focusing on improving his own product, he wasted valuable time mocking WCW, Ted Turner and the former WWF stars who had jumped ship. The skit started as light parody but quickly devolved into mean-spirited personal attacks that made Vince seem like a desperate loser. It was a real low point in the New Generation era and a clear sign that the WWF needed a major reinvention if he'd ever hoped to compete with WCW. Thankfully for Vince and for all of us fans, in 1997 that reinvention was just around the corner in the form of the Attitude Era.